Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Ted promised Leslie a name and a place in his life, and that promise turned out to be a lie stitched together from convenience and cowardice. The way Ted smiles in public, warm, reassuring, a man who keeps his family safe, was always a costume. Behind it there were calculations and a hunger for control that had nothing to do with love. Leslie had believed him the way people believe in safety, because she wanted it so badly that she overlooked the small betrayals at first, the promises deferred into the soft language of one day and soon. When Leslie announced she was pregnant, it was a hinge in both their lives. For her, there was the naive hope that a child would make the man who seemed restless finally root himself. For Ted, there was panic about appearances, about legacy, about the neat image he had built with Nicole that would unravel under the presence of an inconvenient truth. It was not an argument between two hearts, it was a transaction with moral consequences. Bill, sharp-suited, practiced in the calm phrases of attorneys who never reveal how they sleep at night, stood on Ted's side when it mattered. Bill was a man who had been in marriages and near misses. He had counseled clients and old lovers who wanted to disguise chaos as dignity. The deal he offered Leslie was a clean erasure: terminate the pregnancy and leave town with the memory. No fuss, no scandal. Leslie, vulnerable and trusting, was forced into a corner by men whose power included both legal forms and social pressure. Bill's threat was not shouted, it was a legalist's whisper. A promise of ruin if she refused, ruin defined as the obliteration of any future claim to respectability, to custody, to a life. Leslie walked away because she thought there was no other way. It was either leave with empty hands and keep the child alive somewhere far from them. Years later, the quiet calculus of Ted's life threatened to bite him back. Leslie had not disappeared, she had rebuilt. Anita, a distant benefactor connected to Leslie's mother Barbara by a strange twist of loyalty, left a trust intended to stabilize whatever ruin the family had endured. That trust was not an anonymous windfall, it was a ledger of dignity: money to repair roofs, to buy a childhood home, to ensure that a small child could sleep safely. The trust gifted Leslie a house that was more than real estate, it was a symbol that she could stand again. It was in that house that she raised Eva, a curious little girl with her mother's stubborn eyes and the uncanny habit of asking the kind of blunt questions adults avoided. Eva would be the instrument of Leslie's return, not because Leslie wanted to shock for spectacle, but because she wanted to claim a place she had been told was never hers. The anniversary party was the sort of occasion Ted and Nicole had cultivated for years: ornate table settings, laughter practiced to perfection, the kind of small talk that sweeps sins under rugs and exchanges applause for affection. The Dupree family gathered: sisters, in-laws, the half-steps of complicated relationships drifting in like fixtures, expected, glossy, safe. Nicole glided through the room in an outfit that was ceremonial as armor. This was the life she had insisted upon. She had always defended it with a mixture of tenderness and steel. When the door opened and Leslie walked in holding Eva by the hand, the room inhaled as one body. Leslie wore a coat that had seen winters. She carried herself with a quietness that was not humility but a readiness to be seen. Eva, small and defiant, tugged at the hem of Leslie's coat, a child uncomprehending of the adult currents she had stepped into. There was a pause long enough to register shock. Eyes darted like fish, smiles tightened into questions. Nicole's face went white as if someone had cut the air. Ted's jaw closed the way doors do when slammed. Leslie's entrance was not a tantrum but an accusation. She didn't need to scream to dismantle the tidy narrative that Ted had been polishing. The Dupree family's ritual complacency unraveled in that pause. People who once nodded at Ted for his jokes suddenly studied the woman in front of them, trying to reconcile their memory with the facts. Someone whispered that the little girl looked exactly like Leslie's mother Barbara. Someone else, sharper and meaner, tried to draw laughter from the discomfort and failed. Nicole experienced the sensation of being unmoored. Infidelity is a theft disguised as personal failing, but what hurt her worse than the moral treachery was the deception that had structured the last years of their marriage, the way Ted had preserved the image of a faithful husband while manipulating the life of another. When Leslie handed Nicole an envelopino speech, no melodrama, simply the factual truth of a past she had been kept from. Nicole felt the paper like a charge. She read the name of the child, the dates, the proofs Leslie had not been able to forge, medical documents, the name of Anita's trust, a letter from a social worker. Evidence slid into her hands like ice. Everything she thought she knew about the man beside her was suddenly an artifact of performance. There was no graceful place to land after such a reveal. That evening dissolved into legal language. Nicole's anger was sharpened by clarity. She had loved a man who had used her as an anchor while he risked others. She had been expected to keep smiling while men like Bill built fences to protect the men they favored. The divorce papers she demanded were not merely instruments of separation, they were a refusal to continue the charade. She wanted, with a precise fury, to be free from a spouse who weaponized his charm. The conversation Bill had tried to mediate at first to save Ted, to preserve property lines and reputation morphed into an accusation. Nicole would not be bartered out of her pain. She wanted the floor cleared, the house divided, the contract law to mirror the moral law she believed in. Danny, who carried grief like a second skin because of Chelsea's disappearance, watched the unraveling through a lens smeared with raw worry. Her life was a study in suspended motion. She could not force herself to eat, could not sleep, and her world had narrowed into the single point of Chelsea's absence. But she was not so consumed by her own ache that she failed to see Nicole's need for liberation. Family loyalty has fractures that sometimes align with empathy rather than resentment. Danny had no patience for husbands who toyed with other people's lives. She approached Bill not with pleas about his legal craft but with a moral urgency. "Finish it," she told him, in the blunt way someone who has watched another human vanish into unknown terror demands action. Don't let her stay shackled. For Danny, flint of rage mixed with tenderness, she might have been unable to save Chelsea yet, but she could force a man to face his consequences. Bill was not an uncomplicated man. He had previously enabled Ted not with malice but with the kind of quiet compromises that build partnerships between men, favors exchanged, reputations shielded, steps taken so no one would be inconvenienced. He had been the one to issue the gentle threats that pushed Leslie into exile. Yet Bill also had a ledger of his own insecurities, of how the law could be both a tool and a weapon. Danny's request unsettled him. He was married to the rhythms of legal negotiation, able to list statutes and precedent like lullabies. But this was personal in a way that required more than logical calculation. He had seen the way Nicole had loved Ted with an insistence that was not weak but steady, and now he watched that love fracture. He also saw the cost of having helped birth that fracture. When he finally confronted Ted, the conversation was merciless in its civility. Ted's arguments were procedural and petulant. He could apologize in 100 ways and still calculate in the same breath. Bill told him, in the blunt voice reserved for men who understand how law can erase illusions, that the game was over. "Prepare yourself," Bill said, not as a threat but as a legal diagnosis. Ted would need to reconcile with consequences. Ted, who had spent most of his adult life deflecting responsibility with money and charm, felt the walls close. He pivoted because men like him often do toward opportunism. Ted's pivot was not toward the woman he had betrayed but toward the woman he believed he could use. He saw Leslie's new wealth not as a shield she had earned but as an asset he could annex if he played his cards right. His proposal, refined by the whispers of Bill's earlier maneuvers, was a grotesque inversion of romance. He told Leslie he would divorce Nicole and make her his proper partner if she would sign the deed of her house into his name. He suggested a public coalition, an appearance of penitent legitimacy, a new life where Leslie would receive a name stamped with status. For Ted, marriage was a transaction denominated in social capital. For Leslie, it would be a trap. Leslie, for all her suffering and for all the nights she had imagined what returning would feel like, saw the offer for what it was, an attempt to buy silence and a future based on theft. She had spent years tending a child, teaching Eva how to tie shoelaces and how to ask where one's courage comes from. Leslie had become keenly aware that the only protection she had was knowledge, illegal knowledge, emotional vigilance, and the support of people who had not broken her trust. She brought with her a small team, an old friend who could hold the social line, a young paralegal who had taken a liking to Eva, and a journal full of dates and names. She would not be bludgeoned into surrender by the very men who had orchestrated her exile. Yet the theater of this collision was not simple binary. Ted could still play the man who wanted to make amends. He could lean on the public language of remorse, arrange a dinner where he offered Leslie a ring in front of a crowd that would read his gestures as penitence rather than predation. People love the spectacle of redemption. It is easier to accept a man's transformation than to struggle with the mess of his past. And there were practical anxieties. Ted feared losing the life he had built if Nicole insisted on punitive terms in the divorce. He was particularly anxious about the house and about how an unraveling of his narrative might bleed into the finances that ensured his social safety net. Nicole, meanwhile, oscillated between cold rationality and a grief that had the quality of salt in an open wound. She did not want to be a woman who defined herself by betrayal, but she also would not allow herself to be used as a mere stepping stone into a new arrangement that would erase the violence of Ted's past. She pushed for a divorce that would be full, no secret pacts, no backroom dealings, no gift of Leslie's house into the hands of the man who had betrayed them both. Her rhetoric at times was elegant and judicial, at other times it was an animal plea for decency. She told Bill quietly, "If he tries to use her as a shield for his assets, I will make sure every paper is read in public." To Nicole, transparency was not vengeance but a necessary cure. The Dupree family, the social network that had once offered an invisible bulwark for Ted's misdeeds, splintered. Some members whispered in Ted's defense, claiming that the mistakes of youth should be forgiven. Others recoiled, their moral imaginations sharpened by the evidence Leslie had provided. Social life in their town, always performative, was now a stage for interrogations. People who had used Ted's access became anxious about whom they had supported. Partnerships that had seemed unassailable began to reconfigure. Leslie felt the domestic world tilt beneath her. The safety that had been purchased by Anita's trust was imperfect. Legal instruments can be both shelter and currency, and the fear that Ted might seize those instruments by leveraging his own legal resources was real. But she also recognized that humiliation had a limit. There were things that could not be purchased: the testimony of time, the loyalty of one's child, the witness of those who had watched a woman rise from desolation. She convened quietly with Danny once, at a table where Danny's grief softened the edges of determination into tenderness. They spoke, not only of the legal ropes but of what it meant to rebuild trust. "I don't want him to hurt you," Danny said, which both meant more and less than the words implied. It meant she did not want another woman to be dispossessed while she herself was immobilized by fear. The situation escalated as Ted accelerated his moves. He began to sketch the contours of a public reconciliation: dinners, placement of photographs, the kind of staged intimacy designed to convince a town to accept a rewritten story. Leslie, foreseeing the danger, crafted a counter-strategy. She began to collect witnesses, to secure legal support, and to make public the truth in ways that could not be easily brushed aside. In private she rehearsed conversations with Ted, imagining the exact moment she would refuse to be a pawn. Ted, seeing this resolve, redoubled his efforts to seduce the public eye with gestures that could be marketed as remorse. Bill found himself in the peculiar position of enforcer and conscience. He still remembered the night he had stood at Leslie's threshold, the legalish persuasion he had used to make her leave. That memory had the taste of bile now. His professional code said that his client Ted was entitled to representation. His human code said he had participated in wrongdoing that demanded reparation. When he told Ted bluntly that the game was over, he meant it. He had monitors to uphold, lies to unmake, and perhaps a sliver of desire to step away from being the kind of man who protects other men's sins for the sake of convenience. Everything moved toward a pressure point, a scheduled meeting to discuss terms, a town that was watching and building its own verdicts, a marriage anniversary that would now be a site for either reconciliation or ruin. Leslie would not sign anything without counsel. Nicole would not accept anything that smeared her dignity. Bill would not make the old cover-ups without consequences. The night before the meeting, Ted sat in the study and imagined the possibilities: a settlement that preserved his assets, a bride who would clean the scandal like a stain, A house that would remain his. Leslie finished a letter that was not to be sent, yet a testimony of her years away, of the nights she had spent sleeping on Catherine's old couch with Eva tucked against her, of the first day she had stepped inside a home that smelled of linoleum and sunlight and thought, finally, this could be something. She had a list of witnesses, a trail of documents, and a simple plan. She would not be bought. The meeting loomed like a cliff edge. There was a silence in the town that felt like the hush before a verdict. No resolution had been reached. The players were assembled, but their final acts were yet to be performed. The coming days would not simply determine property lines, they would define histories, reputations, and children's lives. Who would be left standing when the dust settled? Which promises would prove to be made of gold and which of thin air? In the charged quiet, each character, Ted, Leslie, Nicole, Bill, Danny, prepared to move with their own motives, their own fears, and their own stubborn hunger for justice or survival. The clock struck toward the morning of confrontation, and no one could say which truths would be hammered into law and which into rumor. The morning of the meeting arrived heavy with silence. A silence so thick that even the clatter of cups at the Dupree household seemed reluctant to echo. Nicole dressed in deliberate simplicity, no bright fabrics, no jewels, only a muted gray suit that carried the weight of intention. She had no desire to present herself as ornamental, she wanted every gaze to fall on the sharpness of her resolve. Her marriage had been curated as spectacle, but its end would be crafted with precision. Ted, meanwhile, rehearsed 100 versions of contrition before the mirror. He lowered his voice, practiced the tilt of his head, even drew upon the words he had heard preachers use when delivering sermons on forgiveness. Yet beneath the practiced performance his mind raced with calculations. What assets could still be hidden? What promises to Leslie could be twisted into contracts? What subtle pressures Bill might apply to bend outcomes in his favor? Ted was not approaching this meeting as a man ready to atone. He approached it as a gambler weighing odds. Leslie prepared differently. She woke early, braided Eva's hair, and packed a small bag of documents that had become her shield. Birth certificates, bank statements, the notarized letter that confirmed the trust Anita had left. It was all arranged with methodical care. She was not coming to plead, she was coming to confront. Eva, curious and restless, asked why they had to meet the man who once abandoned them. Leslie's answer was steady. Because we can't let lies shape our lives anymore. Eva clutched her mother's hand, carrying innocence into a room built on betrayal. Bill felt the weight of contradiction more than anyone. His loyalty to Ted had frayed into strands, each pulled by Danny's insistence that justice for Nicole mattered, and by his own gnawing conscience about what he had once done to Leslie. His role in pushing her away years ago haunted him, and now the sight of her walking back into town, stronger and steadier, left him unsettled. For the first time in years, Bill questioned not just his allegiance but the kind of man he had chosen to be. When they all gathered, the atmosphere was brittle. Nicole sat with her chin lifted, her papers neatly stacked. Leslie arrived with Eva by her side, her silence sharper than any opening statement. Ted attempted charm immediately, greeting Leslie with a softened tone, calling Eva sweetheart as if the word could mend years of abandonment. Eva stared at him with the frankness of a child who recognized distance. Bill cleared his throat, breaking the moment, and began with the procedural outline. Nicole's voice cut through. There is no negotiation about staying married, she said flatly. We are dissolving this today. Every attempt to delay will be seen as obstruction, and I will not be silenced. Ted tried to interrupt, but she held up a hand. For once, he obeyed. Leslie then opened her folder. She revealed not just the documents, but the story behind them, the threats she had endured, the exile, the nights she had raised Eva alone. She did not cry, nor did she rage. Her calm delivery was more powerful than any outburst. Ted's face reddened, caught between denial and the knowledge that every word rang true. The others listened in silence, the air thick with truths that had long been hidden. Danny, though still racked with grief over Chelsea's disappearance, joined the gathering late. Her presence shifted the energy. She was pale but firm, her eyes tired yet burning with clarity. She spoke not of herself but of Nicole. My sister deserves peace. Whatever you do with your property, your lies, Your bargaining hat is on you. But she will not carry this burden anymore. Her words, though sparse, carried a weight no one could ignore. Bill's intervention was decisive. He announced, with the authority of law but the fatigue of a man weary of deception, that the divorce would proceed uncontested. Ted tried to argue, to maneuver Leslie back into conversation about his promises, but Bill's statement stripped him of momentum. Ted looked around the room, searching for an ally, and found none. Nicole's eyes were cold, Danny's unwavering, Leslie's defiant. Even Eva, small and innocent, refused to smile at him. What followed was not a dramatic explosion but a dismantling. Ted's legal defenses crumbled under Bill's management. The property division was set in motion, Nicole's liberation secured. Leslie did not agree to any transfer of her house, her trust, or her dignity. Ted was left cornered, a man who once believed he could choreograph every relationship like a stage play now reduced to silence. Outside the courthouse, rain began to fall, a cleansing drizzle that seemed to wash away some of the residue of years past. Nicole breathed deeply for the first time in months. Danny, though still shadowed by her missing daughter, embraced her sister, whispering that freedom was a beginning. Leslie held Eva close, whispering that they were safe now, truly safe. Ted lingered at the steps, drenched and solitary, his suit damp, his practiced smile nowhere to be found. He was a man who had built his empire on control and manipulation, now staring at the ruins of what he once possessed. Whether he would attempt new schemes or collapse entirely remained uncertain, but the others had made their choice. Nicole chose liberation. Danny chose resilience. Leslie chose truth. Bill, finally, chose conscience. And evanescent, curious Eva walked away holding her mother's hand, a living reminder that from betrayal can rise a new story, one not dictated by Ted's ambitions but by the women who refused to be silent any longer. The Dupree legacy would never be the same. The town would whisper, the family would fracture, but for those who had endured the weight of lies, the future was at last untethered. Their scars would remain, but so would their strength. And Ted, left to confront himself, was no longer the center of the story. The weeks that followed carried a strange quiet, as if the town itself were holding its breath after so many storms. Nicole, though newly freed from Ted's grip, wrestled with the hollow aftermath of victory. Divorce papers and property settlements could not erase the ache of betrayal, nor could they soothe the nights when memories came uninvited. Still, she forced herself to move forward, finding solace in routine's morning walks, tending her neglected garden, sharing silent tea with Danny. Small acts of reclaiming herself became the foundation of a life rebuilt. Danny remained fragile. Chelsea's absence was a wound that refused to close, and though she had supported Nicole's liberation, her own world felt suspended. Every ring of the phone, every knock at the door carried the hope it might be news of her daughter. Yet, paradoxically, helping Nicole through her divorce steadied her. By advocating for her sister, Danny found a strength that surprised even herself, as if fighting Ted's corruption was also fighting the darkness that hovered over her own life. Bill withdrew, spending long nights in his office, revisiting case files, lingering over decisions he had once made without hesitation. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel shame not just for enabling Ted, but for the cruel ultimatum he had once delivered to Leslie on Ted's behalf. Guilt turned to determination. He sought Leslie out privately, not for reconciliation, but to confess. "I wronged you," he admitted plainly, voice breaking. "I don't ask forgiveness, but I won't run from what I did anymore." Leslie listened, silent and still, then told him the truth. Forgiveness was not hers to give, because Eva had lived years without a father's acknowledgement. Bill accepted the words like a blow, yet strangely, they freed him. He could no longer rewrite the past, but he could choose to stop hiding from it. Leslie thrived in unexpected ways. Once dismissed as an outcast, she now carried herself as a woman who had faced exile and returned stronger. With Eva beside her, she rebuilt her identity not as Ted's secret, nor as a victim of small-town judgment, but as someone who had carved survival out of abandonment. The trust fund Anita left her was no longer just money, it was security, a platform to ensure her daughter would never face the same vulnerabilities. She ignored Ted's desperate attempts to reconnect, each message more manipulative than the last. What had once been intoxicating rare moments when Ted treated her as if she mattered now seemed pathetic. Leslie had stopped needing his validation. Ted, however, was unraveling. His charisma dulled, his control slipping. He became a man frantically patching holes in a ship already sinking. With Nicole gone, the community no longer shielded him. Business associates withdrew, whispers of scandal grew louder, and his once carefully curated image cracked. He tried to draw Leslie back, promising stability, a future, even a family, but she refused every overture. Alone, he began to spiral, drinking more, lashing out, making reckless decisions that alienated the few allies he had left. For the first time, Ted Dupree faced a reality where manipulation could not save him. The climax came one late evening, when Ted arrived uninvited at Leslie's doorstep. Rain streaked down his face, his tie loosened, his eyes wild with desperation. Eva hid behind the couch, listening. Ted begged, argued, threatened all in the same breath. "You're all I have left," he said, voice trembling. "Nicole's poisoned everyone against me, but you understand me. You always have." Leslie's answer was cold and steady. "What I understand now is that you never loved me. Only what you could take from me. And I won't let you take one more thing." Eva stepped into the room then, her small voice cutting through the storm. "We don't need you." The words silenced Ted more than any argument could. For a brief second, he saw himself through the eyes of a child, selfish, broken, unwanted. He staggered back, speechless, before leaving into the rain, swallowed by shadows. In the aftermath, Nicole, Danny, Leslie, and even Bill found themselves bound not by the lies of the past, but by their shared survival of them. Nicole began to smile again, though faintly. Danny, though still grieving Chelsea, leaned on her sister more openly. Leslie embraced her role as both protector and mother, teaching Eva that strength was not born from wealth or charm, but from endurance. Bill, humbled and quieter, devoted himself to repairing what he could, though he knew some wounds would remain permanent. Ted never regained his place in their lives. Some said he left town, chasing new schemes elsewhere. Others whispered he collapsed into ruin. What mattered was that his power was gone. The ending was not neat, nor free of scars, but it was real. Nicole walked forward unburdened. Danny carried her grief with courage. Leslie carved a future from survival. Bill accepted responsibility at last. And Eva, the youngest of them all, became the symbol of why they had endured, for the possibility of a life not defined by betrayal, but by truth. The gates that once held them in a cycle of lies and manipulation finally stood open, and though the path ahead was uncertain, each of them stepped beyond it, together or apart, but always stronger than before.